All right, welcome back. So this will be our last session. We go over this today, kind of capping off our discussion about the SDLC at large and the many methodologies that are considered software or system development life cycles. We've gone over a lot of different roles. Before I jump to the different methodologies, I want to just kind of cap this off with a question sort of leads into the different methods. Is, well, Christy, I'll single you out since you've had a bunch of great questions. How many people, actual humans, do we need to build a system? Let's say using the methodology we see right here.
At least 8.
At least 8. Why 8?
One for each step, and then someone to oversee the whole project.
It's a darn good guess. Most people forget about the project manager and they say 7 because there's 7 little steps on the board. But both answers are not actually accurate.
1.
1! All you need is one single human being, and they can do all this. It might take them a while, but you hear oftentimes of startup companies, 3 guys in a garage. You'll generally see that one guy's kind of got the money. Maybe he had the idea as well. Typically, if you have the money, they get to go with your idea. And then he might also do some of the initial legwork around the analysis, vetting out his idea. And then he probably leverages a technical guy to come help him in designing the actual system that he's got in mind. And that same technical guy might go about actually developing it. And once it's built, he might have a third buddy who's going to help him do some testing, right? He's going to say, hey, why don't you make sure this works and make sure that there's no issues that are apparent and that customers are going to like it and they're not going to run into a bunch of defects. And they say, okay, great, and I'll help you test it. So both the product guy and the third buddy are doing some testing. In fact, the third buddy might even help out with some of the analysis, because generally speaking, what you're testing is your original functionality. You're saying, I want these things to work when I'm done. So you're going to go back and test that stuff. And then finally, they say, okay, it's ready. They're going to pass it back to the technical guy, who's probably got not only development skills, but the ability to do some compiling of code, some building the code, releasing it onto actual servers, and then they put it out in the real world. And if there's any bugs that come up, these sort of business savvy testing analysis type guys, they might be doing some of the customer support, and then the technical guy might be doing some of the maintenance. And if they play their cards right, they can turn into Instagram. And that doesn't happen very often, but we do see the occasional sale for what it is, $1 billion for 8 people or something, or 12 people, I forget where they split it up, 800 million piece, something like that. So that happens occasionally, but that's a very possible scenario where you'll have 1 or 2 or 3 people executing an entire life cycle, walking through an entire methodology. It's worth bringing up because there is no minimum and there's no maximum, and we've sort of learned over time that there's no perfect methodology. But we've got most of this down. I'm going to actually take the opportunity to erase some of these concepts so we can cover a few more methodologies. And those are things we mentioned before. I mentioned which 2 other methods that are pretty popular?
Agile and RUP?
Yep, exactly. The Agile methodology and the RUP methodology. I'm going to talk about RUP first because it's probably closer in line with what we just went over. So it's sort of a good stepping stone. So the RUP methodology, RUP, I'll write it out, is the rational, we got an E, it used to be a French word I think, but rational, unified process. It's now owned by, anyone guesses? IBM. IBM now owns Rational. They bought a company called Rational. They still have a product suite. Rational Rose manages the process of RUP. And the Rational Unified Process is similar to the one we just went over, but there's less stages, sort of condensing some of the stages we saw before, and we'll see how that goes. So they have officially 4 stages. The stages are inception, elaboration, in order, construction, and transition. So you start by coming up with some sort of idea, right? Just like we saw in the last methodology. The inception of the idea, it requires a little bit of analysis, so they sort of combine early analysis and the idea or the problem you have with the idea of inception. And then you go from this stage to elaboration. It's an arrow here, right? To elaboration phase. And then after you've, I guess I can actually draw a little cleaner, I apologize. You can go from here to elaboration phase. In the elaboration phase, the focus is to elaborate your analysis, right? Elaborate upon your analysis, and so such that you complete your analysis, you've got a well-documented set of documents. They often call, it's worth writing down here, the completed stage of elaboration results in use cases. I write that down because this in particular is a concept that has been borrowed by other methodologies, by, let's say, proprietary corporate methodologies, we'll talk about that in a second, or any other methodology. Use cases are a concept that have kind of come out of the rational unified process that are utilized highly. People definitely found use in them. So then from here, we find ourselves going down to the next stage, which is construction. So we take ourselves from elaboration, where we've got elaborate use cases that are well documented, detailed, into, what does this kind of sound like from the waterfall methodology? Development, right? Essentially at this point, we're just quite simply building some testing going on. And then after we develop or construct our system, we go over here and we transition it. So this is sort of final testing. We do our final testing on things. User acceptance testing, UAT, and then we go from here into the inception phase again. And that's kind of odd. Why did he go back? Do you ask yourself that anyway? Why did he go back?
Just to continually improve it.
Yeah, so one of the differences from the waterfall methodology, which traditionally was a very sort of progressive and not regressive, meaning that it's progressing down the waterfall and it's sort of finishing as it gets to the end of the waterfall, right? Waterfalls, I haven't seen one yet that runs uphill. But so in the rational unified process, you're kind of acknowledging going into it that it's iterative. This is a big concept for the rational unified process, which they iterate through stages. So you start with something and you know you're going to elaborate, come up with the use case, build it, move that into production eventually. But you're not done. You have more iterations you intend upon your system. This is actually something that some of our clients utilize, the RUP process, because they've got very corporate enterprise systems that are constantly being updated or enhanced. They're constantly enhancing them with new features and functionality. So some folks like this concept because of that. And it's iterative, right? You iterate through it. And even if it's just a single effort, let's say you're only planning on doing one release, one version of software, and it's not multiple versions, you could use this because you understand there's going to be issues with the beta, or in other words, the pre-release version before you get there. So you come up with the idea, you elaborate, you go through the development effort, and you realize, there's all these big bugs I didn't anticipate. Going back to the car example, I forgot to put a roof on, right? I went out in the rain and I got soaked. So we got to pull it back in, design a new roof or design a new solution, including the roof, and then eventually we get to the point where we are transitioning again into production. So that's the RUP process. Again, it's now a product or a process that's patented or owned by IBM, and they have tools that you can use the process on any project without any cost. But if you were to have training, I believe there's certification costs, and for that matter, there's tools they sell that manage that process. So that's RUP. R-U-P, RUP. And we'll talk finally about Agile. What is Agile? What does it sound like? What does Agile sound like?
Like it being more flexible.
Yeah, Yeah, agile, like it sounds. I mean, if you're agile, you're nimble, you're extremely flexible, right? And that's the way that this methodology is intended. So it's completely iterative. It's a good way to put it. It's very iterative. There's no set. I mean, there's timelines, but there's no set start and end. It's going to have a start and a completion of a segment with an intended start and a completion of another segment. It's iterating the entire time. There's not really any good way to necessarily draw it, other than it's sort of a cycle that's continuing on. Conceptually, the idea is I'll just kind of write these up a little bit here. It's completely iterative. So RUP is an iterative process or methodology. Agile is entirely iterative. A good way to, again, sort of defining iterative further is that it takes whatever grand scheme you have. Let's use a mobile banking solution. Again, we want to come up with a way to receive checks by way of a picture on a mobile phone, deposit them into a customer's account. You would break it into very small portions. That's what iterative means, right? So you'd start with, okay, I just want to make sure that a customer can log into the app. Build an app they can log into. That's it. Welcome to our app. Boom, we're done. Okay, next iteration. Now make sure they can see their account. Build that functionality. Account view. Great. Okay, we're done. So they go through this idea of breaking a large scope into multiple small chunks, many small chunks, multiple smaller scopes. I mentioned BRDs before. What does a BRD stand for?
Business requirement document.
Christy again. A business requirement doc. So a BRD, a business requirement document, is similar to a use case, right? We said in RUP you have use cases, and that's a lot like what a BRD would be, right? The definition of a bunch of cases where someone would use your software. In Agile, they don't use BRDs per se, and they don't have use cases as a concept for the most part, but they do have requirement documents. So requirement docs, so rec docs, but are typically very simple. Not to say that they don't have any complexity, but they're just very short, very simple. Not always, but typically one page, maybe 1 to 2 pages. But you think of an Agile team, a lot of times, we had 1-page requirement documents. We were all about being able to turn and burn. We build that 1 page of detailed specs, and then we move on to the next iteration. That typically is done on a daily basis. They'll review that 1 page, and that daily meeting, they have a formal meeting, and they call that a scrum. It's a scrum meeting. It doesn't have to be daily. It could be semi-weekly, it could be every other day, but for the most part, it's a regular meeting that's going to happen pretty often, and I think you find that typically it's every day. Again, like this is typically 1 page, typically daily. And within that meeting, there's generally going to be someone who runs that meeting, or at least runs the review of the very simple docs, make sure that sort of reviewing progress from the day prior, identifying any challenges. That person that we would think of as kind of a project manager in the traditional methodology is actually referred to as a Scrum Master. Scrum Master. So that's another interesting concept that comes out of Agile. Instead of project managers, they have a Scrum Master. I think the reason that this has been kind of commonly used is because at least at first, when Agile's been around for a little bit now and it's gained some traction. At first, it wasn't a methodology that needed a separate person to handle project management. It was considered overhead. One of the core concepts of getting away from the waterfall methodology is that people would take forever to build a system, like 6-9 months to deliver software. And in that time, your competitor, going back to the mobile banking application, might have already come out with the software faster than you because they're moving more quick, they're more nimble. Maybe they minimized functionality, but they got to the real functionality customers wanted. could be an advantage. It also could have other issues if it's not robust enough, it's not a secure solution, or not secure enough. So they've got to be careful, weighing out those benefits and risks. But Agile is considered one of the methodologies that will get things to market faster. Are they better? That's debatable, but it'll get things to market faster because you can deliver more quickly. And one of the core concepts was removing the overhead of a project manager. You don't need an overhead, you don't need that role. You have a scrum master, and that could be anybody on the team. In fact, it would be somebody who had a role on the team, like a developer or doing further analysis. So you had a scrum master. Nowadays, as it's become sort of more enterprise adopted, you see that there are actual dedicated scrum masters. There are a set of tasks they're managing, and they're worried about the same concepts. They're worried about that triangle, right? Staying on time, attacking with the question mark, attacking the scope, and making sure they're not wasting money, burning cycles and not getting things accomplished. That same pyramid: scope, timeline, and budget. The other thing that they use, and this isn't always the case, but I'll get on to give you a typical concept, is that they use a sprint to break down their iterations. So each iteration is usually considered a sprint, and that just means a period in which they're going to build a component or a module. They're going to build something, and that's generally, and not always, it's up to the team. But generally, you see it as a 2-week sprint. So every 2 weeks, you've executed some component. Right? You're building things every day, you're checking on the progress in the Scrum or whenever the meeting's going to be. But at the end of the 2 weeks, you've got to finish. You've got to be done. Another reason why some product managers like this is because this really drives people to complete deliverables within this, let's say 2-week sprint, if that's your timeline you ascribe to, which is oftentimes the case. So in other words, if you're not done and it's 1 week and 6 days into it, you're not leaving, right? You got to get things done. And let's see what else. PM, Scrum Master. Anything else I want to cover? There is one more thing that's kind of interesting. As it's becoming more popular in the enterprise culture, people realize there are some shortcomings because in the enterprise world, a big concern, especially as you're a public company, and depending upon your sector, whether it be healthcare or insurance, financial, even e-commerce these days with the purchases going on credit cards and making sure that financial information is secure. All those industries at large, as you become a public or a Fortune 500 company, are concerned with compliance. So one way they've sort of shot down Agile over and over again is compliance. So they're coming up, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but in order to be a little more enterprise worthy, they've come up with some things to sort of address enterprise concerns. And there's a framework, the scaled Agile framework for enterprises. It's written SAF lowercase e, so capital S, capital A, capital F, E. The Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprises as a solution so enterprises can adopt Agile should they be interested in doing so at an enterprise scale. And that's actually a good point that I want to finish on here, is that none of these methodologies, and hopefully we've got all this down here so far. We've covered Waterfall, we've covered RUP, and we just went over Agile. None of these are necessarily the only way to do it. There could be others we haven't covered. There certainly are. What you generally find in large companies, most of our clients, is that they're leveraging their own corporate. We've got our own corporate methodology. Insert name here, right? The Chevron methodology, the Wells Fargo methodology, the Seagate methodology, the Cisco methodology. It doesn't necessarily mean that every group in that organization is using only that methodology, but there may be certain groups that are required to do so. Generally speaking, as I point this out, they are using one of these, the waterfall, or traditional or the Agile, or the RUP, and they either just renamed it, or more likely they're borrowing concepts from one and focusing on another. A great example here would be, a lot of companies still leverage waterfall pretty heavily, but they want to move faster, so they'll maybe use waterfall with iterations on sort of sprints, or they might just say we're gonna iterate through the scope of our efforts here in 2-week cycles, or for that matter, something we see very commonly is that I said before, use cases are extremely useful. It breaks things down into usable scenarios. That's what they call them. They call them scenarios in which you'll use the system or the software, and it has actors, and it has conditions, so preconditions, post-conditions, things that are required, and that it's definitely something people have taken to in terms of how to analyze a problem and get into the details of the analysis and come up with a good story, a good requirements doc as a use case. So you'll see commonly a waterfall methodology on a corporate level where they're using use cases to do the analysis, which borrows from RUP. So that's often the case, is you got your own private methodology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something entirely different. As we saw even with these, they all kind of leverage the same concepts, right? You have to have an idea or an inception of an idea or a problem, and then you got to think about it and analyze it. You got to then design a way to solve it, which you might do sort of all in one lockstep if you're in the RUP method, right? Design and analysis. Eventually they're going to build something, or they're going to construct something, and at some point they're going to test it, and at some point they're going to put it out in the real world, and at some point they're going to have to fix it or maintain it, and it happens all within any of these corporate or formal methodologies. Any questions?
No.
All right, well that concludes the coverage of the review of the SDLC, the system or software development lifecycle. Thank you.